The dawn of June 22nd, 1941, it brought no peace. It brought thunder of steel. Without a formal declaration of war, the sky over the Soviet border exploded with the roar of thousands of engines. German planes crisscrossed the horizon like dark swarms, while artillery began to spit fire. The ground trembled. Entire villages awoke to shattering windows and roofs flying through the air. It was the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Ahead came the Panzer, divisions, endless columns of tanks, armored vehicles, and trucks raising clouds of dust. The steel tracks crushed fences, crops, roads, everything in their path. To the German soldiers, this seemed the pinnacle of human power. They advanced so fast that often they didn't even know exactly where they were on the map. They only knew they were going east, always east. Soviet border posts were swallowed up in minutes, communications cut off, barracks bombed before the men even managed to put on their boots. Many Soviet soldiers were still trying to understand what was happening when tanks were already appearing on the road like metal monsters emerging from the morning mist. The German strategy was brutal and efficient: surround, isolate, and destroy. It wasn't just attacking, it was clenching the fist until it crushed. Entire armies of the Red Army were encircled by two armored arms that met behind them, forming gigantic pockets. Inside these encirclements, thousands of men were trapped, without ammunition, without food, under constant bombardment. The air smelled of smoke, burnt earth, and hot metal. The advances were so rapid that German units were breaking through, hundreds of kilometers in a few days. Roads were clogged with Soviet prisoners marching under guard, wounded left behind, and destroyed vehicles scattered like iron skeletons. For those inside the German war machine, the feeling was clear: nothing could stop it. The officers spoke openly: the Soviet Union will fall, like a rotten door. The propaganda reinforced the idea that the campaign would end before the cold weather arrived. Many soldiers believed they would be home by Christmas, but that trust came at a price. As the columns advanced ever deeper into enemy territory, the distances became gigantic. Supply lines stretched like ropes about to snap. Trucks drove tirelessly. Horses pulled cannons until they collapsed from exhaustion. And yet, no one stopped, because the order was clear: to advance without giving the enemy time to breathe. But behind the dust, the noise, and the initial victories, something dangerous was already beginning to take shape. The war, which was supposed to last months, was turning into something much bigger and much more deadly. The avalanche of steel had begun to descend the mountain, and no one yet realized the abyss that existed down there. After the massive sieges and crushing victories in the first few weeks, the German leadership believed it was one step away from the final blow. On the map, only a symbolic and strategic prize remained: Moscow. The Soviet capital was not just a city, it was the political, railway, and psychological heart of the Soviet Union. To capture it would mean, in the German mind, breaking the enemy's backbone. The order that went down the chain of command was always the same: speed. The panzer columns advanced day and night. Soldiers slept sitting in moving trucks. Officers studied maps by flashlight while explosions could still be heard in the distance. The pace was inhuman. There was no pause to catch their breath. Every hour counted before the Red Army could reorganize. Along the way, the scene was one of devastation: burned villages, abandoned fields, bridges destroyed by the retreating Soviets themselves. The Russian strategy was beginning to change. If they couldn't stop the Germans head-on, they would make the land bleed behind them. Depots were set on fire, tracks torn up, food taken or destroyed. The invaders advanced, but found less and less to sustain their own advance. Even so, German confidence was still high. They had just won colossal battles such as Smolensk. Generals said the enemy was on the verge of collapse. Propaganda reinforced this. One more push, and it's all over. But this push came at a high price. Fighting along the road to Moscow was constant. Pockets of Soviet resistance sprang up in forests, villages, and crossroads. Hidden machine guns would suddenly open fire. Anti-tank guns, camouflaged with branches, waited for armored vehicles to pass so they could fire from the side, where the armor was weaker. Each advance required gunfire, explosions, shouts of orders, and men falling in the mud. And the exhaustion was starting to take its toll. The soldiers no longer marched with the enthusiasm of June. Beards grew, uniforms were dirty, boots torn. Many couldn't remember the last night they slept in silence. The noise of engines and gunfire seemed never to leave their heads. Still, when someone asked, "Where are we?" the answer was always encouraging: closer to Moscow. In some places, German scouts were already talking about roads leading directly to the capital. The idea that the Nazi flag could fly over the Kremlin seemed real. Officials said that the fall of Moscow would force Stalin to negotiate or cause the regime to collapse. But while the Germans raced forward, something silent was racing against them: time. Summer was dying. The days were getting shorter, the nights colder, and the distances in Russia weren't shrinking, they were only increasing. Every kilometer gained left the German armies further from Germany, more dependent on fragile roads and supplies they could barely keep up with. The race to Moscow was no longer just a military advance. It was a desperate gamble against geography, the climate, and the resistance of an enemy that refused to fall. Then came the rain. Not a passing storm, but days and days of rain falling on the black earth. Of Russia, turning everything into a sea of mud. This period had a name that the Germans would learn to hate: Rasputitsa, the season of roads that ceased to be roads, trucks that once advanced in swift columns now bogged down up to their axles. The wheels spun, throwing mud everywhere, but the vehicle wouldn't budge. Soldiers climbed down, pushed, shouted, cursed, sinking up to their knees. Sometimes even the tanks, giants of steel, got stuck like heavy animals in quicksand. The rhythm of the Blitzkrieg died there, suffocated in the mud. Cannons couldn't be pulled. Ammunition wasn't reaching the front lines. The wounded awaited evacuation that never came. Horses, thousands of them, tried to pull carts loaded with supplies, but many simply collapsed and never got up again, exhausted, covered in mud, breathing with difficulty until silence fell. Paved roads were rare. Most of the German advance depended on dirt tracks. Now those tracks were sticky rivers. Broken vehicles were left behind. Spare parts didn't arrive. Europe's most modern army was being defeated on the ground. Meanwhile, the Soviets were gaining something precious: time. Time to bring in reinforcements. Time to reorganize shattered units. Time to prepare new lines of defense. Every day of German delay was one more day for the Red Army to breathe. On the front lines, the fighting continued, but chaotically. Units were isolated because the rest of the column couldn't reach them. At night, men tried to sleep in. Shallow, soaked holes, shivering inside their heavy, waterlogged uniforms. Mud clung to their clothes, weapons, and food. Nothing stayed dry, nothing stayed clean. And along with the mud came the cold. It wasn't yet the deadly winter, but it was already a warning. The wind cut through damp skin. Soldiers woke with numb fingers. The vapor of their breath became visible, and everyone knew. If this was only the beginning of the cold, what would come next? German commanders looked at maps and saw Moscow still there, not so far away, but each kilometer now felt like days, not hours. The offensive that had once seemed like a sharp blade now dragged on like a wounded animal. Germany had planned a quick war with rapid movements and massive encirclements. But Russia had another plan: swallow the enemy slowly, to trap him, tire him out, and prepare him for something far worse. The mud wasn't just dirt. It was the first warning that nature had entered the war, and it was not on the side of the invaders. If the mud slowed the Germans down, the cold came to break them. At first, it seemed like mere discomfort. Mornings with thin ice on puddles of water, breath turning into smoke in the air, soldiers rubbing their hands, stamping their feet on the ground to warm up. Many were still wearing summer uniforms because the command believed that the campaign would be over before winter arrived. They were wrong. Temperatures began to drop to zero, then below zero, and they kept going down. The wind cut his face like invisible blades. His skin cracked and bled. The metal of the weapons burned his bare hands like living ice, and the German army was not prepared. The grease from the weapons froze inside the mechanisms. Soldiers pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. Machine guns jammed mid-combat. Bolts had to be warmed by hand or even by breath before they would work. Every shot became a struggle. The vehicles suffered even more. Engines wouldn't start in the morning. The oil turned into a thick paste inside the engines. Batteries died. To try and start them, men lit fires under the engines, risking setting their own vehicles on fire. Trucks that wouldn't start were abandoned. Tanks lay motionless, useless giants freezing in the field. But the worst part wasn't the machine, he was the man. Soldiers would wake up with numb, white feet, unable to feel their toes. Frostbite. Some tried to remove their boots and discovered that their socks were stuck to their skin. The pain, when the blood started circulating again, was unbearable. Toes and fingers darkened, dead before their owners even realized it. Sleeping became dangerous. Anyone who closed their eyes without sufficient protection might simply not wake up. Roommates nudged each other during the night. "Hey, stay awake. Don't fall asleep now." The water in the canteens froze. To drink it, you had to melt ice. The food arrived as hard as a rock. The cold seeped into your bones and seemed to live there. And all this, while the war continued. Gunfire still rang out. Explosions still tore through the frozen earth. But now every movement required twice the effort. Digging a trench in the rock-hard ground was nearly impossible. Wounded men who might have survived before now died within minutes because their bodies couldn't take it anymore. The Germans had trained to face armies. They hadn't trained to face an enemy that couldn't be seen, but that killed without making a sound. Winter didn't attack with bullets. He attacked silently, coldly, slowly. And that was only the beginning. There was a cruel, almost ironic moment when some German soldiers believed that all the suffering had been worthwhile. Further along the front line, scouts reported something unthinkable months earlier. The domes and towers of Moscow could be seen in the distance. On clear days, through the biting cold, the Soviet capital seemed right there, close enough to touch. But that was a cruel illusion. The units that came closest were exhausted beyond human limits. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes sunken, their beards covered in ice. Many men were already battling fever, infections, and frostbite. Ammunition was counted shot by shot. Food was rationed into minuscule portions. Even so, the orders were to advance. Every meter gained now came at a brutal cost in blood. The Soviets defended every village, every forest, every road, as if it were the last place on earth. Machine gun nests, hidden under the snow, would suddenly open fire. Cannons emerged, camouflaged among wooden houses. The sound of gunfire echoed dryly in the icy air. The Germans attacked, took up a position, and barely had the strength to entrench themselves. The ground was frozen like concrete. Shovels hit and bounced back. Many positions were just men lying behind mounds of hardened snow, trying to protect themselves. Meanwhile, Moscow was growing stronger. Trains arrived in the city carrying fresh soldiers from the east, Siberian. Troposphere accustomed to brutal temperatures, equipped with white winter clothing, suitable boots, and training to fight in the snow. For them, that cold was not a death sentence. It was part of the battlefield. On the German side, a feeling was growing that no one wanted to admit. They had gone too far. Supply lines were stretched to their limit. Every bullet, every piece of bread had to travel hundreds of kilometers across destroyed roads, frozen mud, and Soviet attacks. Often, it simply didn't arrive. And there, before the capital that symbolized the ultimate victory, the German army was like a runner who falls to his knees a few meters from the finish line, lungs ablaze, legs weak, vision blurred. They could see Moscow. but they no longer had what was needed to take it. And behind them, in the vast white expanse that was beginning to dominate the landscape, something was moving. The Red Army was not dead. He was preparing to attack. For months, the Germans repeated the same phrase like a grim mantra, echoing in the icy tents and makeshift barracks. The Russians are finished. It was a comforting illusion, a self-imposed prophecy that masked the growing shadow of doubt creeping into their weary minds. But Russia was too big, immense, infinite, a living continent that swallowed entire armies like an awakened leviathan, and too stubborn to die like that, to succumb to the Nazi Blitzkrieg that had devoured smaller nations in weeks. No, the Soviet Union was not fragile prey. It was a wounded beast, but still pulsating, regenerating itself in the depths of its vast territory, where the cold and the distance conspired against any invader. While the Wehrmacht wore itself down, advancing mile by mile through dense forests, rushing rivers and endless plains, the Red Army was transforming itself into something terribly resilient. Entire factories had been dismantled in the West, in a colossal evacuation operation that defied human imagination. Imagine, entire production lines, smoking furnaces, heavy machinery like tanks, all loaded onto creaking trains under the constant bombardment of German Stukas. Millions of workers, men, women, even children, toiled day and night, dismantling the nation's industrial heart amidst the chaos of the invasion. These complexes were rebuilt beyond the Ural Mountains, in remote cities like Sverdlovsk, Chelyabinsk, and Magnitogorsk, out of reach of the German bombers roaring in the western skies. There, in the cold, isolated steppes day and night, T-34 tanks appeared, their sloped armor deflecting projectiles as if mocking Nazi engineering. 76 military cannons spewing fire with lethal precision, Mosin-Nagant rifles, simple but indestructible, ready for the hands of inexperienced recruits. The Soviet machine, which seemed broken in June 1941 when the panzer divisions broke through the borders in an avalanche of steel and fury, now roared again, a deep and menacing roar that echoed across the snowy plains, promising revenge. And then they came, the specters of Siberia, summoned from the icy depths where winter reigned supreme, more cruel than any general. Entire divisions like the 316th Rifle Division, commanded by heroes such as Panfilov, arrived from the Arctic regions, accustomed to the extreme cold that would freeze an ordinary man in minutes. Men in thick wool and bearskin coats, Ushanka hats that protected their skulls from the razor-sharp wind, felt-lined Valenki boots that insulated their feet from the treacherous ice. Many had known how to ski since childhood, gliding over the snow like silent ghosts, transforming the hostile terrain into a network of invisible paths. For them, the snow was not an obstacle. It was a road, an ally, perfect camouflage that made them invisible to German eyes accustomed to mild European summers. While the Germans shivered in thin summer uniforms, ill-suited to the general winter that Stalin had invoked as his greatest ally, the Soviets moved with unwavering resolve across the white terrain, their steps firm and calculated, as if the cold were an ancestral blessing. Wehrmacht soldiers, thin and exhausted after months of forced marches and incessant fighting, watched through fogged binoculars as white figures glided across the frozen landscape, emerging from the mist like apparitions from a nightmare. They were not ghosts, they were troops, prepared for that icy hell, hardened by years of training in taigas where temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees Celsius, where the air froze in their lungs and the metal of their weapons clung to exposed skin. Terror crept in subtly. A German soldier, huddled in a shallow trench, saw a white silhouette approach, fire, and vanish into the whiteness, leaving only the echo of a muffled scream and the smell of gunpowder mixed with ice. And it wasn't just the equipment, that paraphernalia of survival that the Soviets mastered like no other. It was the will, a fierce, unbreakable determination, forged in the crucible of revolution and now inflamed by the barbaric invasion. The defense of Moscow had become a matter of national survival, a primal appeal to the Russian soul that echoed in Stalin's speeches, broadcast through crackling loudspeakers in factories and on the front lines. Civilians dug trenches with rusty shovels under the grey, snow-laden sky, their calloused hands bleeding on the frozen ground. Women and teenagers carried heavy sandbags like burdens of guilt, erecting makeshift barricades in the streets of Moscow where families once strolled in peacetime. Units that had been destroyed months before, such as the divisions annihilated in the border battles of June and July, reappeared with new recruits, peasants from the steppes, workers from the cities, even prisoners released to fight, all united by a visceral hatred for the invader who burned villages and massacred entire populations. Soviet officers, once purged by Stalin in his paranoia, were learning from the bloody mistakes of the early war, the encirclements at Kiev, the routs at Smolensk, where hundreds of thousands were trapped in deadly cauldrons. Now, commanders like Zhukov, the ruthless marshal with eyes of steel, reorganized the lines. Deep defense tactics, the use of anti-tank mines buried in the snow, ambushes that exploited the uneven terrain. The resistance was now more organized, tougher, a living wall that flexed but did not break. The Germans no longer faced a disorderly, retreating army, fleeing in panic as in the early days of Operation Barbarossa. They faced an army that was growing stronger day by day, with reinforcements arriving in packed trains, bringing not only men, but ammunition, fuel, and a renewed fury. Frontline reports, scribbled on crumpled papers under the dim light of lanterns, spoke of well-coordinated local attacks, swift counterattacks that caught the Germans by surprise, and the efficient use of the Katyusha artillery, Stalin's organs, that howled like demons, launching salvos of rockets that transformed enemy positions into infernos of fire and shrapnel. The enemy, previously disorganized and bewildered by Stalinist purges, now fought with increasing discipline, coordinating infantry with tanks and aircraft in assaults that echoed the lessons of the Russian Civil War. And each day of German delay meant more Soviet reinforcements arriving, divisions from Central Asia, Mongols mounted on cold-resistant horses, Uzbeks and Kazakhs, who brought with them traditions of nomadic warfare, adapted to the merciless winter. The psychological shock was enormous, an abyss of despair opening up in the souls of the Wehrmacht soldiers. Nazi propaganda, orchestrated by Goebbels with diabolical mastery, had promised a short campaign, an inevitable Soviet collapse, a quick victory before Christmas 1941. But there, under the grey sky and the biting cold that pierced their bones like needles of ice, the soldiers saw the stark truth. The enemy was not dying. He was rising from the ashes of his initial defeats, taller, stronger, with eyes blazing with hatred. Fear settled in like an icy fog. What if the Russians were infinite? What if each dead soldier was replaced by 2, 3, 10? Despair took over the sleepless nights, where the wind howled like tormented souls, and the terror of a prolonged war, a war of attrition where the cold and vastness of Russia would devour the Third Reich, began to corrode morale. Men who dreamed of warm homes in Germany now woke up in a cold sweat, imagining the icy embrace of Siberian death. And when an enemy who seemed defeated rises again, fists clenched and a roar in their throat, the next blow is often devastating, a blow that echoes through history, sealing destinies and toppling empires. The attack came like thunder in the midst of a blizzard, a primal roar tearing through the veil of the icy night, announcing the awakening of a wounded nation. In the early morning of December 5th, 1941, under a white sky and a biting wind that lashed the skin like invisible whips, Soviet artillery opened fire along wide stretches of the front, from Kalinin in the north to Yelets in the south, a barrage that seemed like the end of the world. Explosions ripped through the frozen silence, echoing like the final judgment, with 150mm howitzers and heavy mortars spitting death in coordinated volleys. German positions, already fragile after months of grueling advance, were shaken by shrapnel and shockwaves that kicked up snow, earth and mutilated bodies, turning trenches into mass graves. The air smelled of cordite and blood, mixed with the acrid odor of ice melted by fire. Soon after, shadows shifted in the storm, ethereal forms emerging from the whiteness, like avengers from the abyss. Soviet infantry dressed in white, camouflaged in snowsuits that made them almost invisible against the desolate landscape, advanced in inexorable waves, shouting, "Hurrah!" in unison, a cry that chilled the blood of the defenders. Skiers glided along the flanks, swift as wolves on the hunt, bypassing fortified positions and infiltrating German rear lines. Units appeared where the Germans swore no one could cross, through frozen lakes, dense forests of frost-covered pines, treacherous ravines where the wind whipped up deadly snowdrifts. It was as if winter itself were attacking, the general winter that Napoleon had feared a century before, now allied with the Soviets in a symphony of chaos and destruction. The German defenders could barely react, their bodies numb from the 30-degree cold, freezing engine oil and weapons grease. Many were exhausted, with few men per position after the colossal casualties of the campaign. Divisions like the 4th Panzer, once Guderian's pride, reduced to skeletons of their former power. MG-42 machine guns froze at the worst moment, their mechanisms jammed by the relentless ice. Communications failed miserably, radios crackled with interference, field telephones were buried in the snow, or had wires cut by explosions that sounded like localized earthquakes. Shouts of orders mingled with the howling wind, lost in a cacophony of panic and despair. German officers, like von Bock in Army Group Center, received fragmented reports. Enemy attacking en masse, flanks breached, urgent reinforcements needed. But what arrived were only echoes of an ongoing catastrophe. In several places, the German lines simply gave way, like rotten dikes under a flood. It wasn't an organized, meticulous retreat like in the Prussian manuals. It was men running backward, stumbling in the deep snow, trying not to be swallowed by the red tide that pursued them. Vehicles stuck or frozen were hastily abandoned. Panther tanks with dead engines, Opel Blitz trucks buried up to their axles, left as silent relics of a failed arrogance. Pak 88 cannons, the pride of German artillery, were left behind, their still hot barrels pointing to nothing. Documents were hastily burned in makeshift bonfires, flickering flames, illuminating faces pale with terror, while secret maps turned to ashes in the icy wind. The shock was brutal because the Germans hadn't expected it. They couldn't conceive of such a reversal. They had believed the Soviets were at their limit, exhausted after the losses of more than 3 million men in the first 6 months of the invasion. Instead, they faced a renewed army, attacking with fury and confidence, led by Zhukov, who orchestrated the offensive with cold mastery, exploiting the German weaknesses that had been stretched too far. The cold, which already punished the Germans with frostbite that devoured fingers and noses, now worked in the enemy's favor. Soviet troops moved better in the snow, using sleds pulled by hardy horses, knowing how to use forests and villages for subtle infiltration. They attacked at dawn, when German fatigue was greatest, exploiting the polar darkness where the sun barely rose. Small groups of partisans emerged from behind the lines, fired with sniper rifles, silently slit throats and disappeared into the fog, leaving a trail of frozen bodies and shattered minds. The feeling in the German ranks was that the ground was disappearing beneath their feet, an abyss of despair swallowing hope and sanity. Reports spoke of a critical situation, exposed flanks, missing units, entire divisions like the 2nd Panzer evaporating into chaos, their commanders captured or killed in ambushes. Terror manifested itself in night visions, soldiers waking to the sound of skis scraping in the snow, imagining invisible hordes approaching, panic spreading like a plague. Men who had marched triumphantly through Paris now trembled in holes in the ground, questioning the Führer's invincibility, feeling the crushing weight of a war stretching into the frozen infinity. And all this under temperatures that continued to plummet, plunging to 40 degrees on endless nights where the air turned to lung-cutting crystals, and sleep was a dangerous luxury that invited hypothermia. The Blitzkrieg was over, its electric speed reduced to a slow, agonizing crawl. Now it was a desperate struggle for survival, hour by hour, day by day, where the fear of being surrounded, the desperation of dwindling supplies, and the terror of a resurgent enemy dominated minds. The avalanche of steel that began in June was being pushed back, not by a single force, but by millions of hardened men, by the merciless ice that froze dreams of conquest, and by an enemy that refused to die, rising like a vengeful titan to reclaim its sacred land. The winter of 1941 was not just a season, it was the harbinger of an epic turning point, where Nazi pride dissolved into the endless white, leaving only echoes of horror and bitter lessons for posterity. The fighting continued, but it was no longer just against the enemy ahead, that Red Army emerging from the icy mists like a tireless horde. It was against their own bodies, treacherous and fragile, succumbing to the merciless embrace of a winter that did not forgive weakness. In shallow trenches, hastily dug in the iron-hardened ground, behind the broken walls of razed villages where Russian families once warmed themselves around wood-burning stoves, or in makeshift holes in the accumulated snow like premature graves, German soldiers tried, in vain, to keep their weapons functioning. They disassembled Mauser rifles with numb fingers, swollen and reddened by the cold that bit like sharp fangs, blew hot steam from their parched mouths onto metal parts that creaked in protest, banged frozen mechanisms against ice-covered stones, echoing a dry, desperate sound that was lost in the howling wind. Sometimes it worked, a reluctant click followed by a solitary shot that echoed like a Pyrrhic victory. Often it didn't, and the silence that followed was the prelude to an announced death. Machine guns jammed in the midst of an attack. At the crucial moment when white shadows, the Soviets in their snow camouflage, advanced like vengeful specters across the merciless white plain. The soldier pulled the trigger forcefully, his muscles tense with terror, and heard only a dry, empty click, like the echo of a broken promise. Nothing. And then he saw white figures advancing through the snow, inexorable, their cries of "Hooray!" mingling with the whistling of the wind, approaching like a tide of death that swallowed everything in its path. Panic then set in, a primal terror that froze the blood more than the icy air. What to do when the tool of survival betrays, when German steel, forged in Krupp's foundries with Teutonic pride, surrenders to General Winter, whom Stalin had invoked as his most faithful ally. The cold robbed them of strength and precision, transforming trained warriors into trembling shadows of their former selves. Hands trembled uncontrollably, fingers stiff as dry branches, unable to firmly pull a trigger or quickly reload a magazine. Eyes watered as the icy wind lashed like invisible blades, blurring their vision in a veil of frozen tears that distorted the landscape into a hazy nightmare. Breath burned in their chests, each inhalation an agonizing burst of cutting air that tore at their lungs, leaving a trail of pain that accumulated like snow in an internal avalanche. Every movement required enormous effort, as if the air were heavy, viscous, imbued with a supernatural weight that dragged their limbs down into the abyss of utter exhaustion. Soldiers who once marched for miles without batting an eye now staggered, their uncertain steps on the crust of ice that cracked beneath their feet, betraying them into traps of deep snow, where their bodies sank as if into cold quicksand. And at night, the night was worse. An abyss of icy darkness that swallowed whole souls. Men huddled together as best they could in cramped holes dug in the frozen earth, bodies pressed against each other in a grotesque parody of brotherhood, trying to share the meager warmth emanating from their weakened forms. Some slept sitting up, leaning against rifles or ammunition boxes, their heads hanging like severed puppets. Others lay on damp, rotten straw, decaying wood from destroyed barns, or directly on the frozen earth that sucked vital heat like an insatiable vampire. The exhaustion was so great, a crushing weight accumulated from days without rest, endless marches and bloody battles, that the body would succumb even in the cold, plunging into a dark, dreamless sleep, a dangerous oblivion bordering on death. And many did not wake, silent victims of an invisible killer that reaped lives without fanfare. Comrades nudged each other in the morning, their hoarse, trembling voices echoing in the frigid air. "Hey, get up!" A desperate call that hung like an unanswered prayer. But the man did not move, his body rigid as an ice statue, his face pale as the surrounding snow, a thin layer of ice on his disheveled beard, his eyes half closed in an expression of eternal surprise, as if death had caught him by surprise in the middle of a distant dream. Dead in his sleep, without a shot fired, without glory or honor, only the cold that penetrated his bones and stopped his heart, turning heroes into forgotten corpses. The terror of this discovery spread like a plague. Who would be next? The comrade beside him, the childhood friend recruited together, or himself, waking up to eternal nothingness? The wounded faced an even crueler fate, a prolonged ordeal that defied human imagination. Without rapid evacuation, trucks bogged down in the snow, exhausted horses starving to death, Junkers planes unable to take off on the ice. Many lay for hours exposed to the merciless air, their groans muffled by the wind. Blood on their clothes froze into hard, red scabs, like grotesque armor sealing open wounds. The pain lessened, not because it improved, but because the nerves stopped feeling, numbed by the ice that rose up their limbs like a poisonous tide, promising false relief, followed by inevitable gangrene. It was the beginning of the end, a slow decline where the body shut down piece by piece, the mind screaming silently as the cold claimed its prey. Frostbite was becoming routine, a silent epidemic that mercilessly mutilated. Toes turned black, swollen and lifeless, forcing improvised amputations with knives heated over a fire, screams echoing through the nights like the laments of tormented souls. Hands lost movement, turning soldiers into invalids who could barely hold a spoon, let alone a weapon. Some men had to be dragged back by exhausted comrades, their bodies like dead bundles dragged through the snow, leaving trails of blood and despair. Others hid the symptoms, afraid of being left behind, abandoned as unnecessary ballast in a chaotic retreat, preferring to suffer in silence rather than face the stigma of weakness. The fear was palpable. What if the next step was the last? What if the cold took not only their limbs, but their will to live? The food, when it came in meager rations transported by creaking sleds, was as hard as stone, frozen in indigestible blocks that had to be broken open with rifle butts. Water had to be melted before drinking, collected from melted snow in flickering fires that barely heated anything, risking dysentery or soot poisoning. The simple act of removing gloves to eat could cost sensitivity in the hands, exposing the skin to the cutting air that burned it like paradoxical fire. And amidst all this, the enemy still fired tirelessly, their bullets cutting through the air with a deadly buzz, grenades exploding in fountains of snow mixed with earth and blood, scattering shrapnel that claimed lives already on the brink of the abyss. But the terrible truth was clear, a whisper of horror echoing in broken minds. The cold was killing almost as much as the combat, an invisible killer that did not discriminate by rank or courage. The German army, trained for swift maneuvers and decisive victories in the Blitzkrieg tradition that had conquered Europe in months, was now fighting a slow, painful and invisible battle against an enemy that entered the bones and never left, corroding the flesh, morale and sanity. The war still roared with its thundering cannons and rattling machine guns, but between the shots there was something more terrifying, the icy silence where men simply stopped, living. A void that swallowed hopes and left only the echo of a profound despair, a hopelessness that settled like frost on the soul, promising that the worst, the unimaginable, was yet to come. On paper, the German division still existed, recorded on crumpled maps and bureaucratic reports sent to distant headquarters in Rastenburg, where Hitler plotted movements with colored markers. They had names, numbers, commanders. The 4th Panzer Division, the 2nd Infantry Division, legendary units that had crushed Poland in weeks and France in months. But in the reality of the battlefield, under the oppressive leaden sky and the snow that fell like an endless shroud, they were fading, dissolving like ghosts in the icy fog, evaporating into a terrifying nothingness that defied military logic. Regiments that months before had numbered in the thousands, their compact ranks marching to the sound of precise orders, now barely amassed a few hundred capable of fighting, skeletal shadows of their former splendor. Entire companies were reduced to the size of platoons, scattered groups of survivors dragging themselves across the desolate landscape. Officers called out at dawn, their trembling voices echoing in the biting air, and heard more silence than answers, names called in vain, echoing like unanswered prayers, while the wind carried away any hope of cohesion. Terror set in at these moments. Where were the missing? Dead in night ambushes, frozen in abandoned trenches, or simply lost in the chaos, swallowed by the Russian vastness that devoured entire armies. And it wasn't always about grand battles, those epic clashes where tanks collided like titans and artillery transformed the horizon into a fiery inferno. Many simply fell out of combat without a shot being fired, victims of an invisible and relentless war of attrition. Extreme exhaustion, a weariness that penetrated the marrow and transformed men into staggering zombies, unable to lift a weapon or follow an order. Respiratory diseases that spread like biblical plagues. Dry coughs that echoed in the nights. Lungs inflamed by the icy air, leading to fatal pneumonia. Frostbite that mutilated and incapacitated, leaving soldiers as invalids, groaning in agony. Infections that wouldn't heal, minor wounds turning into open graves, gangrene devouring tissues in a slow and painful march. Men were evacuated when there was transport, creaking trucks stuck in the snow or sleds pulled by dying horses, and never returned to the front lines, lost in overcrowded field hospitals or simply disappearing into the limbo of war bureaucracy. The ranks grew ever thinner, like autumn leaves falling from a dying tree, leaving bare branches exposed to the gale. Cannons that required 6 men to operate, to load heavy projectiles and precisely adjust sights, now had 2, exhausted and trembling, fighting against the equipment as if it were an additional enemy. Machine guns were left abandoned because there weren't enough men, their cold barrels pointing into the void, silent symbols of a dwindling force. Positions that should have been defended by an entire company with interconnected trenches and coordinated crossfire were now occupied by half a dozen scattered soldiers, trying to appear more numerous than they were, shouting fictitious orders to deceive the enemy and themselves in a pathetic illusion of strength. The psychological effect was devastating, an abyss of despair opening up in minds. Already shattered by continuous horror, soldiers looked around and no longer recognized their own group, familiar faces replaced by the empty stares of inexperienced recruits or, worse, by absences that ached like open wounds. Friends made since the beginning of the campaign, comrades who had shared cigarettes and laughter in camps in Poland or France, had disappeared, killed in Soviet counterattacks, wounded and left behind in chaotic retreats, or simply swallowed by the chaos. Their bodies, lost in the endless snow. The feeling was that unity was dissolving, like melting snow in warm but powerless hands, slipping through fingers in cold drops of irreparable loss. Fear settled in like a dense fog. What if I'm next? What if the entire division evaporates, leaving me alone against the Red Horde? And the enemy perceived this, cunning and ruthless, sniffing out weakness like a wolf on the hunt. Soviet attacks tested weak points, nighttime probes with infiltration groups gliding through. The snow like shadows, encountering less and less resistance, holes in the line where once there had been walls of fire, where before there had been a solid line, an unbreakable barrier of steel and determination. Now there were holes, terrifying voids that invited penetration. Infiltrations happened more frequently, partisans emerging from the forests like demons, cutting communications and sowing panic. Sometimes at dawn, it was discovered that the flank next to you was empty. The neighboring unit had been destroyed in a night assault, retreated in disarray during the darkness, or simply melted in the cold, leaving a deafening silence that echoed the terror of being next. The reports arriving at headquarters were alarming, scribbled on damp papers by officers with trembling hands. Combat strength reduced to 40%. No reserves. Men at their physical limit. Dry words that masked the human horror behind them. Families in Germany awaiting letters that would never arrive. Dreams of victory transformed into nightmares of survival. But orders continued demanding that positions be held, coming from Berlin or Hitler's HQ, ignoring the icy reality, forcing exhausted men to cling to patches of frozen ground like shipwrecked sailors to wreckage. Thus, entire divisions ceased to be offensive forces, machines of conquest that once rolled across Europe like an irresistible storm. They became groups of survivors, scattered bands clinging to fragments of hostile land, trying not to be swept away by the Soviet avalanche that was gaining momentum. The army that crossed the border in June 1941 as a precise machine, lubricated by easy victories and triumphant propaganda, was now a wounded organism, bleeding men day after day in a slow and inexorable hemorrhage. Despair settled in like a permanent frost. How many more would fall? When would the last man raise the white flag? Not out of cowardice, but out of utter loneliness. And the worst was yet to come, a dark horizon, where the Russian winter promised more horrors, more losses, an abyss of terror that swallowed empires and left only echoes of shattered glories. Faced with the growing collapse, an avalanche of defeats piling up like heavy snow on the bowed shoulders of the Wehrmacht, many commanders on the front lines knew, with the bitter clarity of those who saw blood freeze on the ground, what needed to be done. Retreat to shorter, more defensible positions. Shorten the lines stretched like nerves exposed. To the biting wind, save what remained of the exhausted troops, those men who once marched with the pride of conquerors and now trembled like dry leaves in the Russian gale. It was a logical decision, born from the brutal experience of battles like Vyazma and Bryansk, where cauldrons of fire had swallowed hundreds of thousands, but which now, in the merciless winter of 1941, called for a tactical retreat to consolidate forces, regroup shattered divisions, and prepare a defense that could withstand the renewed fury of the Red Army. Generals like Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Blitzkrieg that had torn through France like a sharp blade, pleaded in urgent reports for permission to pull the lines back to rivers like the Oka or the Nara, where the terrain could be fortified with deep trenches and buried mines, where the cold could be combated with better shelter and more accessible supplies. Others, like Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, echoed the same appeal. Their maps sprinkled with red arrows, indicating vulnerable flanks, dangerous protrusions that jutted out like accusing fingers in the white vastness, inviting inevitable encirclement. But the decision was not in their hands. Those who inhaled the icy air, mixed with the smell of gunpowder and decay, who heard the groans of the wounded echoing in the endless nights. From afar, in heated barracks in the Wolfschanze, the fortified bunker in East Prussia, where fire crackled in luxurious fireplaces, and maps were handled with warm, sure hands, came the order that would echo like a death sentence, an absolute decree that sealed destinies with the coldness of a bureaucratic stamp. Not one step back. It was the voice of Adolf Hitler, the Führer whose will imposed itself like a law of nature, distorted by the megalomania that blinded him to the reality of the front. He believed, with a fanatical conviction forged in his own mythology of invincibility, that any retreat would lead to in panic, a rout like Napoleon's in 1812, where the Grande Armée dissolved into the snowy steppes, leaving bleached bones as monuments to hubris. For him, holding the ground was a matter of will, not reality, an irrational belief that ignored reports of colossal casualties, tanks immobilized by ice, soldiers whose thin uniforms tore in the wind like old paper. Thus, exhausted divisions, such as the 2nd Panzer and the 4th Infantry, were ordered to hold open, poorly prepared positions, exposed to the cold and Soviet attacks, salients like those of Klin and Solnechnogorsk, where the lines stretched for kilometers across bare plains, without natural cover, without adequate fortifications, just shallow holes dug in the frozen ground that looked more like premature graves. The outcome was predictable and terrible, a horror that unfolded like a slow nightmare, where each day brought a new layer of suffering, a new depth of despair. Units were trapped on dangerous ledges, their flanks exposed like open wounds, inviting the Red Army to maneuver around them with agile maneuvers, Soviet skiers gliding through the snow like lethal ghosts, T-34 tanks roaring from the unprotected sides, cutting supply lines like sharp knives. As the Red Army advanced from the flanks, pockets formed, makeshift encirclements closing like jaws of icy steel, isolating thousands of men on doomed islands of resistance. German troops found themselves surrounded, cut off from the rear, without supplies, trapped in villages like Istra or Ruza, where burnt-out wooden houses served as makeshift shelters, the air heavy with the stench of unburied bodies and acrid smoke. Within these sieges, the situation turned into hell, an abyss of agony, where time stretched out like medieval torture. Each hour an eternity of hunger, cold, and terror. Ammunition was rationed, counted bullet by bullet, with officers distributing cartridges as if they were sacred relics, ordering shots only at specific targets, while the enemy approached in inexorable waves. Food was divided into tiny portions, pieces of bread as hard as stone, thin soup made from melted snow, and the remains of slaughtered horses, whose frozen carcasses were cut with rusty axes, the blood coagulating into red crystals in the ice. Wounded soldiers piled up in makeshift shelters, overturned barns, or desecrated Orthodox churches, groaning in the damp darkness, their infected wounds oozing yellow pus, without morphine to relieve the excruciating pain, without clean bandages to stop the bleeding, only the cold that numbed their limbs but accelerated gangrene. Soviet artillery bombarded day and night, an incessant hammering of shells and katyushas that howled like banshees, reducing villages to frozen rubble, gravel mixed with blood-splattered snow, where pieces of human bodies mingled with wreckage of wood and twisted metal. The ground trembled with each impact, sending shockwaves that cracked ice and bones, leaving survivors deaf and dazed, their ears ringing with the eternal echo of destruction. Radios desperately pleaded for help, operators hunched over crackling equipment, their hoarse voices echoing in the icy ether. "We are surrounded. We need supplies. We can't hold out much longer." Coded messages, but laden with raw panic, transmitted in trembling Morse code, while batteries drained in the cold, leaving only silence as an answer. Sometimes planes tried to drop supplies from the air, Junkers 52s, roaring low above the grey clouds, parachute crates falling scattered in the snow, many in Soviet hands, captured by agile patrols who laughed at the irony. Others broke open on impact, scattering useless contents in the wind, cans of preserves rolling away, ammunition buried in deep drifts. It was little, always little, a drop in the ocean of need, leaving the starving men gnawing on leather boots or chewing contaminated snow, their stomachs churning in empty agony. The soldiers knew, with a bitter, soul-crushing certainty, that they were trapped by an order that ignored the reality of the battlefield, a decree dictated from a distant bunker where the Führer dreamed of victories while they bled in the icy reality. Frustration mingled with fear, a poison that spread through their veins, muffled whispers in the trenches about the madness of Berlin, about how one man's stubbornness condemned them to a senseless death. They weren't dying for lack of courage. Oh no, these were veterans. Hardened by campaigns in Poland, France, Greece, men who faced fire with Prussian stoicism. They were dying because they couldn't move, chained by an order that turned them into fixed targets, sacrifices on the altar of Hitlerian vanity. Terror settled in like a dense fog, the dread of hearing the Soviet tanks approaching, the deep rumble echoing in the snow, the despair of seeing comrades fall, one by one, without hope of rescue. The despair of knowing that each day brought the end closer. Without glory, only the icy embrace of defeat. And the cold continued, relentless, a constant companion that penetrated tattered clothes, froze sweat on skin, turned tears into crystals on eyelashes. With no possibility of organized retreat, many fought to the last bullet, defending ruins with trembling rifles, firing at white silhouettes emerging from the fog until the dry click of an empty magazine announced the end. When the position finally crumbled under the weight of coordinated assaults, the survivors were killed in savage hand-to-hand combat, bayonets gleaming on the ice, captured and marched to Siberian fields where the cold would be even more cruel, or lost in the snow trying to escape, wandering in scattered groups, disoriented by the infinite whiteness, succumbing to hypothermia that made them fall like broken dolls, their bodies covered in soft drifts like shrouds. These points of resistance that were supposed to hold the line, these stubborn bastions ordered by a distant dictator, ended up becoming mass graves. Graves where thousands lay in frozen layers, their faces contorted in expressions of eternal agony, glazed eyes staring at the grey sky. The order not to retreat did not save the German army, did not preserve the glory of the Third Reich, nor did it stop the red tide. It trapped it in the ice, chained like Prometheus to the rock, vulnerable to the beaks of the Soviet eagles that pecked at its entrails day after day. And it gave the enemy the time and space to crush it, to transform the Battle of Moscow not into a Nazi victory, but into a prelude to the inevitable collapse, where the Russian winter, allied with human stubbornness, sealed the fate of an empire built on illusions of grandeur, leaving only echoes of terror, hopelessness, and an icy silence that would echo through the ages. Modern wars are not won with courage alone. They are overcome with fuel, food, ammunition, clothing, and spare parts. And all of that began to disappear. German supply lines were stretched by hundreds and hundreds of kilometers through destroyed roads, damaged tracks, and regions where almost nothing remained to be salvaged. Trucks broke down, and there were no parts. Horses died of exhaustion or cold. Convoys were attacked by Soviet partisans in the forests, and then winter did the rest. Engines wouldn't start. Fuel tanks froze, lubricants turned to a thick paste, train tracks cracked in the extreme cold, train cars were stranded in the middle of nowhere. What came from the rear often never reached the front. On the front lines, the effects were brutal. Soldiers received half rations, then a third of the ration. Bread as hard as a rock was divided with bayonets. Thin soups barely warmed the body. Ammunition was also scarce. Machine guns couldn't maintain continuous fire. Artillery fired fewer rounds per day than necessary. Sometimes, orders were given to only fire when the enemy was very close. Winter clothes arrived too, and late, and in insufficient quantities. Many still wore thin coats, wrapping blankets around their shoulders as an improvised solution. The German army, which months before had advanced with mechanical precision, now resembled a starving and sick organism. Each position fought almost alone because there simply weren't the resources to keep everything functioning, and the war didn't wait. While the Germans were counting bullets and breadcrumbs, the Red Army was receiving reinforcements, new equipment, and increasing support. The balance was shifting not only on the battlefield, but also in the warehouses, on the roads, and on the railways. Without supplies, even the bravest soldier becomes an exhausted man clutching a rifle that is too heavy. The German war machine didn't break down all at once. She stopped piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left that could move. The night on the Russian front was already terrifying. With winter, it turned into pure terror. Darkness arrived early, swallowing everything. The wind howled between frozen trees and the ruins of destroyed villages. The snow fell in swirls, erasing footprints, silencing sounds, except those that came from very close. That's where the Soviets attacked. Small groups moved almost unseen, their white clothes blending into the surroundings. They knew the terrain, using forests, ravines, fences, and ruins to get closer. Often they would get within a few meters before opening fire. Suddenly, grenades exploded inside the German positions. Gunfire came from all sides. Shouts pierced the night. Soldiers awoke from their confused sleep, trying to find weapons, boots, helmets. Panic spread quickly in the darkness. Communication was nearly impossible. Telephone wires buried in the snow were broken. Radios failed in the cold. Officers shouted orders that the wind carried away. Each group fought as best it could, often without knowing where the enemy was. And the cold made everything worse. Hands were slow to obey. Weapons jammed. Men stumbled in the deep snow, fell, got up, disoriented. The sound of gunfire echoed strangely, difficult to pinpoint. The Soviets used this as a psychological weapon. Sometimes it wasn't a large-scale attack. It was quick infiltrations, isolated shots, sudden explosions. The goal was to prevent the enemy from resting, from sleeping, from thinking. Exhaustion became a weapon. German soldiers were beginning to fear the night itself. Every shadow seemed like an enemy. Every crack of ice sounded like footsteps. Many were so tired they could barely distinguish dream from reality. When dawn arrived, it revealed the result. Scattered bodies, partially destroyed positions, men vanished into the darkness. These weren't gigantic battles like in the summer. They were constant blows, cutting slowly. Gradually, the Soviets were not just pushing back the German line. They were breaking down his mental resistance, night after night, under the snow and wind that never stopped. Even with the order to not retreat, the reality on the battlefield became impossible to ignore. In several sectors, German positions were so exposed and so reduced that remaining there meant certain annihilation. Some generals made a decision that could cost them their careers. Or worse, they ordered a retreat. It wasn't an elegant maneuver. It was about survival. Units received the order in the middle of the night or during brief pauses in combat. Prepare to move. Men collected what they could carry. What couldn't be taken, cannons, broken vehicles, ammunition boxes, was destroyed or abandoned in the snow. The withdrawal was taking place under constant pressure. Columns moved along ice-covered roads under Soviet artillery fire. Vehicles got stuck or wouldn't start. The wounded were placed on makeshift sleds or left in shelters with the uncertain promise of rescue. Many would never be seen again. Discipline was beginning to crack. It wasn't a chaotic stampede everywhere, but the fear was palpable. Soldiers walked with hunched shoulders, looking back, expecting to see the enemy emerge from the snowstorm. Officers tried to maintain order, forming temporary defensive lines, but everything was improvised. The scene on the roads was one of defeat. Tanks without fuel, broken wheels, dead horses frozen beside the wagons, heavy weapons left where they were left, and the cold continued to take its toll. Men would collapse during the march, too exhausted to continue. Comrades would try to lift them, but sometimes they had to keep going. To stand still meant death. For many German soldiers, that was the moment when the truth became clear. The lightning campaign had failed. They no longer advanced as conquerors. They retreated like survivors, trying to escape a gigantic disaster. Every kilometer back wasn't just lost ground. It was proof that the war in the East would be neither short nor merciful. Not everyone died from gunfire or explosions. Many were defeated by the enemy who made no noise. Makeshift medical posts filled with men whose feet were blackened by necrosis, whose hands were swollen, and whose faces were burned by frostbite. The smell of dead flesh mixed with weak disinfectant filled the air. Doctors worked almost without rest, with simple instruments, little light, and almost no anesthesia. Amputations have become routine. Saws cut through bones while men bit down on pieces of leather to stifle their screams. Finger, foot after foot, entire hands were removed in an attempt to save lives. Sometimes it worked. Often the body was already too weak. Diseases spread rapidly. Pneumonia, dysentery, infections of wounds that never healed in the constant cold. Soldiers coughed up blood into their sleeves. Others trembled uncontrollably even when covered in blankets. And there was utter exhaustion. Bodies that no longer had the energy to fight, nor to keep warm. Men would sit down just for a minute and never get up again. Comrades would shake them, call their names. Silence. This passage shows that the Soviet winter silently killed thousands of Germans through hunger, cold, and disease, weakening the army even without major battles. When the snow melted in 1942, the wreckage and bodies revealed the scale of the disaster. The Wehrmacht was no longer the invincible force of 1941. Divisions destroyed, veterans lost, and troops exhausted. The myth of German invincibility ended. The Blitzkrieg died near Moscow, and it became clear that Germany could be defeated. There began the long road to Berlin.